All right, thanks, Jill. Appreciate it. All right, Tess, would you like to give us your update, please?
Yeah, for sure. So hi, I'm Tess. I'm with the Gold Ridge RCD, and I've been working with Adriana and the folks at the Sonoma RCD to just kind of create some countywide RCD forestry, outreach materials for all of our programs, and we've been doing that a lot, especially with our NRCS grants like RCPP, and also with our regional grant and BFIP. So yeah, hopefully we'll be releasing some of those soon. But yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Kathleen Kraft, we haven't had your presence for a while. Welcome.
Hi, great to be back. Hi. So yes, my update is that I have moved off the Wheeler Ranch and I'm now living up on in Peter Meyer's house at Ocean Song and working with land paths on their land management.
Oh, fantastic. Good.
Yeah, it's been great. I'm really enjoying it.
That's great. That's really nice to have you back. Sophia.
Hi. So I'm more based in Marin, but doing a lot of stuff with educational programming, I'll say, focusing on defensible space, doing things with certain groups, like a group called Fire Foundry, which is it's kind of modeled after the Conservation Corps with their education, but really with a focus of kind of shuttling people into fire careers and fire adjacent careers, and doing things about that. And then also launching a new youth program on fire resiliency and forest ecology and wildland fires and things like that. And that's going to be coming up in April 1st. If you want to know, it would be great to use this group to get some of the word out. So I might be posting something if it's permissible, since one of our workshops is going to be up at Pepperwood on April 1st. So I'd love to see if we can get more attendance to that and get some numbers out there. Anyways, haven't had my second cup of coffee yet, so I'm a little dopey this morning.
No worries. Thank you very much. Stephen Swain.
Yeah, so working with some people across the state, UC is looking at potentially, or at least the Oaks group is looking at potentially doing some workshops to share what we use for homeowners, probably broken up into homeowners and rangeland owners, in terms of figuring out resources for oaks and oak woodlands, and sort of doing this is what these are the references we use. This is how we use them. These are what, we look for them for, to sort of, and then we're also considering how we might sort of boost traffic to the existing resources that already have an awful lot of information in them. We run some websites called Ask an Oak Expert or Ask a Forest Expert that has questions where people can submit questions related to their trees, their oaks, their forestry project to advisors from across the state. And we're getting an awful lot of people asking questions that are already in the FAQs. And so the question is, how are we going to drive resources to the FAQs and the stuff that's already out there, but people don't seem to know how to find, if that makes sense. So that's something we're toying with right now, and I'll keep you posted. We're probably not going to have anything out. Well, we might have something out before the end of the year in terms of a workshop and those kinds of things. Anyway, that's my update for what we've been doing on things relevant to forests.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephen. Appreciate that. Ron?
There, hi. I don't have much to add. The RCD's meeting next Thursday, and I don't have the minutes from our last meeting, so I can't really, but as you know, we're doing a transition with our our staff and all. And gee, I'm waiting for Jason to tell me what he's got. I noticed, so there's been quite a bit of chatting back and forth since that last Gualala meeting, which I thought was pretty successful considering composite meeting, and a lot of discussion and stuff brought in since, and it's all back and forth email stuff. But yeah, I think Jill's told you as much as I can tell you, and if Jason calls in, then we'll know more. So.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Eric, would you like to give us a download?
Oh yeah, so I've been working on the handbook, kind of for multi-benefit land management. I think probably several of you know about that here, but we're just trying to basically, we have a great high level outline, and now we're trying to put that into practice. So starting to get more resources, reach out to people like yourselves, and make sure that information gets into the book. Yeah, even just hearing about what Steven's up to, I'm like, ooh, that's very interesting. We'll have to chat at some point. But yeah, things are moving forward. Very excited about it. I'm happy to be here. Also, it's nice to hear Kathleen's voice.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eric. Caitlin.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add to what Eric said. We just are also continuing to write grants and do fee-for-service projects to do multi-benefit land stewardship activities on public and private land over here, mostly in Sonoma Valley, not entirely. So those are always full of lots of lessons. Every site has something to say.
Right. Nice. All right. Thanks, Caitlin. Fred, you frat.
Not much to add, just engaging with various programs and working a little bit with Ivan O'Neill to try and update the way management plans are made using modern technology.
Very nice. Good. Ray Krause.
Mark West Watershed, we're continuing to implement a couple of grants. We have a broom removal volunteer day on Saturday as part of our Calistoga Road shaded fuel break. We've got a whole new forest challenge in snow downed timber, snow downed branches from all our live oaks. It's been a huge amount of damage to the trees that survived the fire. So a whole new round of pile burning has begun. But I'm not up to the details. So, and I don't see anyone else here from the watershed, but that's all I can add today.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for joining us. Carleone.
Hi, everybody. So first, I'm showing off my snow from a week ago, which was something else, I tell you. Kind of a cool winter. I'm really happy to see the sun today, but the rest of it, water everywhere. Yeah. I just wanted to be real quick and give you an update on the CWPP, and Kim, pop in as necessary because we've been hunting as a pack on this last bit of it. The document itself has gone to review by the board, so that's up in Legistar, as we say. So we are hoping that will be signed off by the board on the May 9th meeting. It's an item of significant interest on the consent calendar at this point. We're sort of hoping it stays like that. It could be shifted to the calendar. We're not sure. So that is it. At least it's done. And now what we're really working on is getting the project entry portal ready for everybody to start throwing all their projects in. Our desire for that portal is that everybody throws their stuff in there so that we get a really good sense of what's been done, what's being done, and what people hope will be done in the county on that overall map. It will also provide you a place to list your project in a CWPP as required by the health force or described in the Health Forest Restoration Act and asked for in many grant applications. So it kind of behooves everybody to get their projects into the CWPP. The ranking criteria, we're not ranking projects anymore. We're just screening them for a couple of things that are it's a very low bar. It's, do you own the property? If it's public land, do you have permission from the public, from the land management agency to list that project? So, you know, if you've described a giant project in some park somewhere, we need to know that the parks know about that before we list it in the CWPP project list. And does it comply with the 15 project priorities that we described in the CWPP? And that's kind of it for the criteria. So it's a very low bar for getting your project in there. We are hoping it's going to take 15-20 minutes to get the project in. There is a mapping component, and then it's just mostly yes, no questions. You know, overall, you know, is this defensible space? Is it a wildlands? Is it a post-fire restoration? What are the treatment options that you're considering, which are all just click buttons? And I think it's much more user-friendly than it was before. It's kind of in beta right now. I'm just finishing up. Every time I think I'm done with the questions, I talk to somebody who goes, well, but what about the da-da-da? And so it's a little hard to push it all the way through, but I think we're almost there. And then I will be sending a request to everybody to enter all the projects that they want to on that map, because that will give us this overall view of what's going on in the county, what people want to do, what needs to be done, where are we missing projects that we should have projects, where there are 5 projects doing effectively the same thing in the same footprint, so that we can, you know, help people move those to finding funding. So that's the idea. We're working a little bit with Kim, and we're not exactly sure the two tools are going to work together. I think some of his base information for his program will be in the CWPP, but we're working out the details of that, and I'll let him cover that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Carleon. And so following, oh, go ahead, Adriana, you have a question?
Yeah, Carleon, would you like to give us a demonstration at the April meeting of how to use the project entry tool, or do you think April might be too soon?
I hope not. Can we do that on the I certainly hope so basis?
Yes.
Kind of tell you where it's at. Yeah, I'm hoping it'll be done by then. I
You're
really
damn straight it will be done by then.
Yeah, right. So I think Kim went to the cattle prod supply store, especially. He's on me. Kim's on me.
That's right. And
yeah,
so,
that'd be great. But yeah.
I'm really excited about this tool, and it's an integral part of our request for proposals for the Vegetation Management Grant Program, which I'm happy to announce is going to be published on next Wednesday, March 22nd. So it will be our 3rd round of Vegetation Management Grant Program through 3rd cycle, and the criteria are pretty close to what we've done in the past and what we support in the past, but we've completely integrated the CWPP project types as part of that description of what's going to be approved. And so our intention is to have the request for proposal open on the 22nd of next week, and our intention is to have a requirement that every project that's submitted to Ag and Open Space has to go through and complete the survey on the CWPP. So that's kind of not necessarily double dipping, but just kind of making sure we're getting and encouraging everyone to submit their proposal into the CWPP, their project type. So that's the game plan. The deadline for that grant will be April 20th at 5 p.m. So I will be able to share more information to this group via email. And if you have any questions, once you wait until you see the RFP, then we can talk. And we'll be hosting 2 workshops on one on March 28th and the other on April 11th from 5 to 6:30-ish. And typically what we have myself, Robert Aguero from Permit Sonoma, and Ben Nichols, who share essentially what we're trying to accomplish with the Vegetation Management Grant Program, as well as an intro to CEQA requirements and some of the things that we've seen in the past. And then Ben Nichols from the perspective of CALFIRE, what are some of their priorities and things that why they're helping us to support this project. So that's probably our biggest news. Adriana, do you have any updates?
No, not at this time.
Okay, great. And so let me see, Arthur Dawson, do you have an update you'd like to share, or do you want to wait till your presentation?
I'll just, yeah, my presentation is basically my update. So.
All right, that sounds good. Great. Great. Well, thank you folks for those that great round robin. So I'd like to move on to following up with the counteracting wildfire misinformation. And I'm wondering, Adriana, do you want to lead this session and just kind of give us a sense of what our intention was there?
Sure, yeah, and this should be really fast. I just wanted to say that I captured some of the comments from our last meeting where we just kind of had a really organic conversation about what kind of misinformation we are hearing, or not even, I think I renamed it from misinformation to identifying and addressing common misunderstandings or areas of conflict, because I think we had talked about like, well, we don't really want to label this misinformation. We wanted to just say like these are some like kind of areas of conflict that we're work. And so I have put that into a Google Doc. You all are welcome to look at it, edit it, make sure it reflects what we talked about last time. And then you know, it's kind of open to everyone how you'd like to use that document. I think it'd be nice to start collecting resources and references that can help us navigate those conversations in the future. I wasn't able to do a search for those, but you know, for every kind of conflict, there's like a response. And if you have some documents that you'd like to offer up as a potential response, that would be great. I was thinking too that this that might be a good document for us to look at as we craft the content for the conference, and just kind of keep some of these things in mind. So we are sort of ready to encounter some of those common areas of confusion or misunderstanding, and hopefully be ready to address them so that they don't sort of continue to be unaddressed. I'm talking really vaguely because there's a long list of things on there that yeah, I don't want to, like, it's hard to be more specific, but yeah, you can go ahead and click that link and take a look at what's written on there. And like I said, use it as you wish. It's nothing official either. It's just like notes for us, basically.
Yeah, and I think this was an issue that kind of motivated our grant selection committee last year to award a grant to Sonoma Ecology Center and UC Extension to think about if we can get this information in a handbook that would represent Sonoma County and the challenges, the unique challenges that we have here, that kind of have a kind of counter argument to model vegetation treatments that are being instilled upon us by other areas of the state that aren't necessarily appropriate. So that's one of the motivating factors to helping us to develop the handbook is how can we get the best information for our particular forest types and habitat types so that we are doing good by nature and helping to protect our communities and our properties. So great. Well, thank you for that. Let me see our next topic. So is there anything else that other people want to share on that particular topic, or any questions? All right, seeing none, moving on. So we'd next like to share an update on the 2023 Living with Fire Forest conference coming up on June 23rd and 24th. Adriana, do you mind taking that one on?
Sure. Yeah. So I've written an update in the agenda, which you all can read. Basically, yeah, we're looking at the date of June 23rd to 25th. We're still trying to determine if we want to do a Friday, Saturday event or a Saturday, Sunday. Right now, it's looking probably more like it'll be Friday, Saturday. And we have a save the date and survey that's linked in the agenda. So we would love if you would share that with your community, with your neighbors, and get it out there, because we want people to start putting that date on their calendar and taking our survey. The survey gathers information about what people are interested in learning or hearing about. And it's also kind of gathers a little bit of demographic information about who is interested in coming. And that will help us design the conference content.
Are you guys seeing the survey right now or the agenda?
Oh, you're showing the save the date.
Yes, good. All right, great. Yeah.
Perfect.
So just to kind of get people aware that we were just trying to be able to get more feedback on, well, first of all, get people excited about the conference, as well as get their feedback on what we think are the most important things, and answer some critical questions like whether Friday, Saturday works better for landowners or Saturday, Sunday. I think we're leaning towards Friday, Saturday. At least that's what the supervisors know as we're doing. So we don't want to, we want to get down, really set straight our agenda so that we can start inviting all our speakers. So that's great. Thank you very much for putting all that information together. Any
Sure,
other
yeah.
questions about that?
Well, I guess I'll just add on to that we're also, in the process of developing the content. And just as a reminder, day 1 is a day of like kind of indoor sessions and outdoor sessions at Shone Farm. Day 2 is at various sites across the county where we're looking at the projects on the ground. And as we continue to develop that, we will come back with more updates and share that with you. But so far, the smaller subcommittee is taking all of that on. If you would like to be more involved, please join the subcommittee. Just email me and I'll send you our meeting invitation. We meet on Thursdays from 11 to noon. And we're also going to be hiring a coordinator to help with some of the event logistics, just to kind of take some weight off of the group. So you may be hearing about them in the future as well. And that's it.
All right, great, thank you. And then also Sashi Sabaratnam is also very active as part of our brain trust for this particular event. I think she's going to be taking more of an active role to help us kind of get across the finish line. So we've been, just for those who are relatively new to the group, we've been thinking and planning this since September of last year. So there's a lot of work. This is a great example of a democracy. And so we encourage you to participate, but we're not going backwards. We're not going to restructure our conference objectives. We're going to keep moving forward with the things that we've decided, but we definitely want input on the speakers. We're really kind of nailing that down right now. Some of the important topics, how we're structuring the conference, we really are excited for folks to be participating and really get put together the best show possible. So for those who haven't had much experience with the Forest Working Group, this has really been one of our most successful contributions to the work that we do in conservation, forest management. Has been these conferences that we've hosted, about 3 prior to this. The last one was in 2017. It included a focus area of all the way up the North Coast. And so we had, as I believe, something around 150 participants in the last event. So it was at the JC and the Central Campus, but again, Shone will be a great example, opportunity as well. So any of the other conference members have anything they want to share, or conference planning members? All right, fantastic. Great. So I think with that, I think we're ready to roll into Arthur's presentation. If you're ready to go up, do you need to warm up your vocal cords or anything, Arthur?
All right, thanks, Kim.
Perfect, perfect. All right, have at it.
Great to be here, and thanks for giving the opportunity to share this work. I've been doing this This particular project is almost 3 years, and it's actually started with a much smaller project that I did for Audubon Canyon Ranch at Bouverie Preserve and that area. So, which started just in the spring of 2017. So this was kind of a propitious time to start this. So let me share my screen, and let's see, go here, and then. Are you guys seeing the full screen of the, okay, cool. So this was a grant from CALFIRE. I contacted Pepperwood to see if they'd be interested, and they wanted to partner. So we partnered, and then we brought in Tukman Geospatial, which many of you probably know Mark Tukman, who was kind of the prime mover on the Sonoma Veg map. And then also brought in Jim Thorne, who's at UC Davis, and he was one of the prime people for some of the vegetation mapping in Napa. And he's also done a lot of stuff with historical mapping, like bringing the Wieslander maps from the 1930s, vegetation maps, digitizing those and making them available online. So he was a great person to have involved. And I come to some conclusions out of this work, or at least some ideas, but I also want to caution people, this is the fire-prone landscape. So this is not talking about everywhere. This is some selected areas, in these 3 counties. And so, we chose these places because CALFIRE had identified them as places where communities or the natural resources were at risk. So that was the first filter. And then also it was places where there was historical vegetation data that was available. Because I've found in the past, if you can develop a picture of vegetation from, one point in the past, and then you basically have 2 snapshots. You have the past and the present, which is interesting and good stuff to know, but it also, if you only have 2 points, then you're automatically probably going to find a trend as opposed to seeing a cycle if one exists. So it's important to have a whole suite of vegetation records. In this case, we had 4 snapshots over 150 years for each one of these locations. So it was a big area. Some of the data was already digitized and easy to get at. Other data was more difficult. We had to digitize it during the project. So just to orient you a little better, because there's no cities on this map. So the city of Napa is down here just below and this says treatment area because that's CALFIRE language, but I'm using the word study area because really we didn't treat anything on the ground, but we studied all these areas. So the city of Napa is down here a little bit to the south of the Napa treatment area, which includes Atlas Peak. So that whole kind of west slope of the Miacamas above Napa Valley. Then the Sonoma Napa study area was this area right here. And you guys can see my cursor, right? I'm assuming. Anyway, the Sonoma Napa study area crosses the ridge between the 2 counties. So it's, it's a location of things like the Nuns Fire and the recent one, and also 1964 and other fires. And this line is just the county line. So it's kind of interesting to compare the west slope with the east slope. And then we've also got Jim Thorne suggested doing something, a little bit further to the west. So CALFIRE had identified this area around Guerneville as high fire risk. Guerneville is right off the southwest, or actually is at the southwest corner of this study area. And if you know Mount Jackson, that's kind of up here in the middle. And then the lake study area, Cobb is right in the middle of this. Boggs State Forest is also in this area. Clear Lake's a little bit to the north, and Middletown is a little bit to the east. So that was the biggest area. These varied in size to some extent, but they're all, the smallest one was the Sonoma West, which is about, I think about 20 square miles, and Lake is about 75 square miles. So the various sources that we used, come from this, about 150 years So looking at all these different places to get vegetation data, some of these will be more familiar, the more recent ones probably more familiar to folks. And then the further back you go, the less these have been used recently because it's hard to get to the information. And then, so that's vegetation. And then fire data, we've got the CALFIRE maps, which are really great going back to about mid-1940s. But if you go before that, you have to go to written accounts, mostly newspaper articles. And there's a surprising amount of data in those. If you get those and add in, maps from those eras, which often show the names of ranch owners, you can actually trace perimeters of a lot of these fires pretty well. So we brought those in. But then kind of a third piece of this was to try to weave in some of the indigenous wisdom that is here in the county. And I'll talk about that more in a minute, which also includes, local knowledge is just sort of a lighter form of that. I've done a lot of oral histories with old timers and they've told me things. So, this sort of human knowledge that exists that in a lot of ways, it kind of stitches together both of these, the fire and the vegetation as a single thing, as opposed to being two separate silos. And I should mention, we should have time for some questions at the end, but if you have any questions that you want to put into the chat and we don't get to them, then I will answer them, by email later on. So just to sort of give a spoiler here, these are some of the takeaways from this project. There's surprisingly dynamic vegetation patterns, that run their course over a few decades. The places that are most fire prone are also the places where the fastest vegetation seems to occur. Douglas fir has vastly expanded. I won't read all these. I will come back to these later. And then there seems to be a possible tipping point for catastrophic fires at about 60% woodland cover. And I'll explain more about that and how I'm identifying catastrophic fire. And then for some reason, Napa is an exception to a lot of these, which I can't explain, but I'm going to be talking to the Napa folks directly, probably in the next few weeks. So it'll be interesting to see their take on this. So I want to start with indigenous wisdom because, I think the place that a lot of us are these days is we're realizing that the way things have been done for years isn't really serving us anymore. And we're looking for other ways to do things. And the forest group is a great example of people who are, really on the forefront of trying to change the ways, we manage the landscape, trying to change our relationship with the landscape. So I got to talk to several indigenous elders. Probably the most significant one was Clint McKay, who's up at Pepperwood he's a chair of the Native Advisory Council. And, his connection with this area and with fire, I asked him, so what's the earliest cultural burning that you remember? And he said, well, I probably was in a baby basket. He grew up on the Dry Creek Rancheria. And he said, really, my people have been burning, since time immemorial, going back thousands and thousands of years. So, I can't really say what was first because it was happening before he was born. So he told me a lot of things. I don't have time to share a lot of it right here, but a couple interesting things was, I definitely got the impression that things were happening at a very fine scale basis. So people were burning, a hunter might burn a certain plant to encourage straight shoots when it resprouted to be used for arrows, or they might burn chaparral to encourage forage for deer. So, watching the chaparral and burning when it seemed like the time was right. And he said, yeah, but they would sometimes burn areas of a couple hundred acres and depending. And one thing he said, I kept pushing him to tell me, like, well, how often did you guys burn the chaparral? Was it every, 3 years or 5 years or every 5 to 10 years? And he said, you have to understand, like, I don't think of it in calendar terms. You know, he's just observing and deciding when to burn according to what he's seeing on the landscape, as opposed to having like a strict schedule of burning every 5 years. And so, you know, I think maybe one of the most important things about the Indigenous perspective is not that we're going to get some very specific schedules, specific approaches. It's more other ways to think about our relationship with the land. You know, I like to think of people having a relationship that's more like a marriage. You know, we talk about land management, but you know, if I said that I manage my wife, I probably wouldn't be married very long. So I think it's more like a marriage than a hierarchical relationship. Here's Clint up at Pepperwood with his family, preparing to do a burn. And, you know, one thing I got from the Indigenous folks is that fire can be a force to create community. You know, we've seen it happen after a catastrophic fire, when people really come together to help each other. But fire can also, you know, cultural burning can also be a way for people to come together that's not catastrophic. So that's an interesting other perspective. And Clint also had this perspective about cultural burning versus prescriptive burning. And it's all about what the focus is on. You know, are we trying to just benefit people and preserve infrastructure, or are we thinking about the whole environment? I also got to speak with Sarah Moncada, who's the director of Heron Shadow out in the West County. Really interesting place. They call themselves a biocultural oasis, and it's dedicated to serving the Indigenous people of Sonoma County and also basically throughout the Americas. You know, she's doesn't have local roots, but she is a Native American Yaqui tribe. And this was a really interesting quote. You know, to think of fire as a community member, and if you put it in that context, you know, if you exclude somebody, they're probably going to get pissed off. And if they do come back, you know, they may cause some damage. So I thought this was just a really interesting perspective on it. And of course, this is, you know, kind of the opposite of Smokey the Bear's opinion on this, but a whole different way of thinking about fire. So, you know, I don't want to claim to be speaking for Indigenous people, but I will say that, you know, these insights kind of rose up for myself as I had these conversations. And I'm not going to go into detail on all these, but one thing is that, you know, fire and plants and trees, they have agency. They're doing their own thing. And I'll show you some examples of particularly Douglas fir that you watch, you know, what's happened over the years, and you realize like all that's going on without any intervention by people, pretty much, except maybe fire suppression. But you know, they're doing their own thing. You know, being humble. You know, we're never going to know everything. We have to make decisions based on limited knowledge, and we also need to admit that we're not in control. And I think that's important. I mean, I think a lot of us got that after 2017, those people who lost houses. And I know firefighters were kind of shaken up by that here was a situation that could not be controlled. So if we can't control it, then what's our proper role as human beings? So that's something to reflect on. And I'll leave the rest of those. And, you know, bullet points may not be the best way to present these ideas, because that's a very Western way of presenting this. But anyway, that's kind of meant as a little bit of a joke, but also a little bit of trying to get an outside perspective on the way we're looking at things. So one last quote. This is Redbird Willie, who's the stewardship coordinator at Heron Shadow. And when I showed him some of the maps that have come out of this project, he said, well, that's how the land looks when it's not being tended properly. And so here's an example, some pictures from a survey line from the 1870s that at that time, 150 years ago, was reported as being covered with chemizal, which is chemise. So obviously it's completely changed in 150 years. And, as it turns out, 150 years, my great grandparents were born in that decade. So that's going back, 5 or 6 generations. If we go forward to my kids, that's about 7 generations. And the way that Indigenous people talked about, their stewardship really was thinking long-term, thinking about, generations down the line, and and really in that sense, creating generational wealth for the future. So I think the best way to take, the perspective of Indigenous people is to use this as a perspective on what I'm about to show you. And the more I thought about Redbird Willie's comment that this is what the land looks like when it's not being tended properly, I think he's probably right. I think that's a good way to look at all this. So in a sense, this is what it looks like after things have kind of gone downhill and where things go. So let's start with a historical record. We're going to jump into a whole bunch of data. We're going to dip into physics just briefly in talking about catastrophic fire, and then we'll come back to the Indigenous perspective at the end and some ideas for the future. So this is the earliest record that I know of about cultural burning in Sonoma County, exactly 200 years ago. And this is the man who founded the Sonoma Mission. And interestingly, he mentions the effect of that cultural burning, which was to keep things from getting too thick, keeping things kind of open. I won't go over these in detail because I'm going to cover these in my presentation, but these were some of the questions that we went into this and asked, and some of the questions that came up in the process of this study. And kind of this triangle sort of gives an overview of sort of, how I was trying to approach it, which is, what's the relationship of fire and vegetation? What's the relationship of people and fire, relationship of people and vegetation? How do all these things sort of interact with each other? And also, as someone who lost their home in 2017, and as along with thousands of other people, I'd like to know, is there actually a tipping point for that kind of a fire? Is there some point where we could say, if we could just dial it back a little bit, maybe we could avoid such huge conflagrations in the future? And then in thinking about that, how do we improve our relationship with the landscape? So let's go to vegetation data. Now, vegetation data is, it's tricky. We're comparing data that's been collected over 150 years by different people for different purposes. So one of the approaches that I used was to, it's kind of a corollary of Occam's razor, which is that the simplest explanation is usually the best, or choose the simpler one over the more complicated one. And in this case, it means choosing fewer categories means you'll probably have less error in your interpretation. And all of these records, even going back to the early surveyors, were recorded. They recorded vegetation in the order of abundance, which that's actually a direct quote from the survey manual from the 1850s. So all this vegetation data was collected with that overarching framework. So I want to thank Mark Tukman. I think he was planning to try to come here today. Many years ago, he said, well, you should, and in thinking about how to align this early data with what he was doing with the Sonoma Veg Map, he told me, see if you can get it to line up into life forms. And as it turned out, that was actually not that difficult, even with the early data. And these are the 3 categories that you'll see in the Manual of California Vegetation. So you have grasslands or herbaceous, shrublands or chaparral, and woodlands. And woodlands, there's enough data. You can also divide that into 2 forms, which is conifer and hardwood. And then there's the human footprint, which is never very big in any of these places. It's never over, I don't know, I think 15%, 20%. It's usually more like between 5 and 10. Now you can drill down in these things, like you can get a finer grain picture of what's happening with the forest, but as far as a first pass, comparing, the past and the present, this is the direction that I went. Okay, let's take a close look at this one, and I'm going to focus, on Sonoma County. There'll be a few slides I'll probably brush over because there are other places. So this, if you're familiar with the township and rangelands on topo maps, those were all walked by early surveyors back in the late 19th century. And they were supposed to record at the end of each line of survey, and these are 1 mile squares. So these are sections, each one of these defines a section. At the end of each mile of survey, they were supposed to write down the vegetation in order of abundance. Now, they also marked trees, and I did capture that data, but it's a little trickier to work with. So for right now, we're just going to look at what they wrote down for the line description. So for example, and just to orient you again, Glen Ellen is immediately to the west, and you can see Oakville up here to the northeast. And there's Bouverie Preserve is right in this area, and Glen Oaks in this area. So for example, the surveyor walking this line right here, when he got to the end of that mile, he wrote down something like mostly chaparral, or mostly only chamise, made a notation that didn't really talk about trees at all. So I considered that to be shrubland cover. And this legend over here, this is what I'll be using throughout the whole presentation. So hopefully it's pretty intuitive. Yellow for grassland, orange for shrub, blue for hardwoods. Think of blue oaks, although there are many other oaks. Conifers is green. The human footprint's red, just to make it stand out. And then occasionally there's other things like water or bare rock, and that's just gray. So sometimes the surveyors would walk a line and they'd say, oaks, scattering oaks with chaparral. So then you'd get something like this line here, which has a dashed line. The conifers are up here. A little bit of grassland, not much grassland, and a little bit of human footprint, but again, not much human footprint really. Okay, let's go ahead 60 years. And this is from the Wieslander map. UC Berkeley researcher made this map in the 1930s. And you can see there's a lot of chaparral in this map. I mean, there's some correspondence between the chaparral in 1930s and the chaparral in the 1870s. The woodland is mostly hardwood, a little bit of conifer, and some human footprint. Okay, let's go ahead another 60 years. And this is the Fish and Wildlife map, the wildlife habitat relationship map. And you can see there's a decrease in chaparral, quite an increase in conifer, and probably an overall decrease, in hardwoods. And then if we go ahead to 2013, the Sonoma Veg map, you can see that chaparral has really declined. The conifers are taking over a lot of areas, and there's still a fair bit of hardwood, and there's increasing human footprint. And I'm covering a lot of territory. Let me just say that I'd be happy to come back and give this presentation to any groups that are interested. Happy to answer questions online, and the report will be out at the end of next month, so you can then dive into all of this in as much detail as you like. So I'm just trying to give you a real overview. So for the rest of these, I'm going to show you they're set up like this. It's like a timeline. So on the left is the early years coming forward to the present, and then that's also interpreted in these pie charts at the bottom. So you'll notice in the early years it was almost half chaparral, and recently it's been less than a quarter. So just a small amount, and also increasing conifers. Okay, this is the study area out by Guerneville. So Guerneville is kind of covered up by this line here, but it's the southwest corner. And this 1867 is actually before there was any really significant logging in the area. There was some certainly, but logging really took off in the 1870s once the railroad arrived. So this is a almost pristine landscape as far as the forest goes. So the big trees all down here along the Russian River. And what's surprising to me is that you have chaparral up in the hills, just a mile or two north. You've got chaparral right not far from those big trees. There was cultural burning going on in this area at least up into the 1850s. So 1867, this is still probably the remnants of what was happening with cultural burning. And an interesting little thing here, this thin line, which doesn't show up very well, I apologize, but that's the footprint of the Walbridge fire 2020, which I think Fred knows quite well. And so the Walbridge burned this whole area up here. And interestingly, the Walbridge footprint, follows a lot of these old chaparral areas. Okay, now in this case, we don't have another map till 1965, so almost 100 years. So this is post-logging. The logging went from the intensive logging went from about 1875 to about 1915. And at that point, it was pretty well logged out. So 1965 represents about 50 or 75 years of recovery from logging. And you can see a lot of this, the conifers in 1867, it's now been replaced by hardwoods. And there's still some chaparral up here, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. 1993, the conifers are really moving in, the chaparral's declining. And by 2013, the conifers are really taking over. And the human footprint seems to be shrinking. And I think that's just because the conifers in the settled areas are growing and expanding their canopies and covering up what you might see from above. So I don't think the human footprint is actually smaller, but the trees are bigger. Okay, I'm just going to skip over lake because that's kind of outside of our area, but I'm happy to come back to that. And Napa as well. The only thing to mention about Napa is that it seems to be an anomaly among these four areas. You can see there's not nearly the dynamic vegetation changes happening in Napa, even though it has a similar fire history. And I can't explain that. I'm going to be interested to talk to people in Napa. I did talk to one person who grew up around Atlas Peak, and she said, from her knowledge, there have never been very many fir trees up there. There's not even enough to show up on the most recent maps. She said the fir trees were down in the canyons, but they weren't spread over the land like they are in these other places. Okay, moving on to fire data. So as I mentioned, we got the CAL FIRE perimeter maps, then you go back into the newspapers. So the newspapers would mention places that burn, ranches, such and such a bridge burned on, such and such a road. And you can find a lot of these locations by going back to the old county maps and plotting them, and then just using that to draw a perimeter. And then in many cases, the newspaper articles talked about, a 2,000 acre fire, threatened this ranch and burned so-and-so's barn and wiped out the bridge on this road. And using that information, you can draw the perimeter. And then I also gave each one a confidence level so that to give some idea of how accurate these perimeters were. So that's how that was done. So now jumping right into the fire history, and I do have, with the GIS, you could click on any place on this map and it would tell you what fires had occurred there. But for right now, we're just going to look at places where fires have recurred over time. And you can see even in this fire-prone landscape, there's quite a variety of fire histories. Everything from no documented fires up here in this purple area that I've labeled the rare burn zone, over to here with the red. This is the frequent burn zone. So this is 4 to 7 fires have occurred there in the last 150 years. And we're going to take a closer look at some frequent burn zones in a little bit. But there were two ways that I chose the frequent burn zone. One was, frequent fire, obviously, but also these were areas where we could go back to a specific point in time and say, this whole thing burned in a certain fire. So in this case, this whole thing burned in 1923. A lot of it did burn in 1936. And then the whole thing burned again in 1964. And the whole thing burned again in 2017. So frequent burn zone, or the FBZ, as I've been calling them. So one of the pleasures of this work is getting to invent my own acronyms. So anyway, that's the frequent burn zone. Sonoma West also has a frequent burn zone. And you might be curious why there's no rare burn zone here. And I didn't delineate it because, and I'm not going to cover it today, but there's actually a map from the 1920s that shows what had been logged off by that time, which was just after the end of intensive logging. And it's basically this whole area down in here. This was all logged between the 1870s and about 1915. And as a consequence, this is an assumption, as a consequence, there haven't been, fires down in this area. That could change, certainly, with climate change and the regrowth of trees. So the frequent burn zone is up here. And we're going to take a closer look at this in a minute. So this area burned, the smaller areas here burned in the 20s and the 30s. And then the whole thing burned in 1959. And then the whole thing burned in the Walbridge fire in, I think that was 2020. All right, we're going to just kind of skip over Lake. And the only thing to say about Napa is that the whole thing, well, except for about 1%, less than 1%, this whole thing has burned over that 150 years. So it's harder to delineate a rare burn zone. I had to take a place that was 1 or 2 fires instead of no documented fires. Okay, now this is really the fun part, integrating the vegetation and the fire data. So let's go to the frequent burn zone in the Sonoma West study area. So again, this is just north. Here's Guerneville down here. So just a few miles north of Guerneville. And again, remember early on, I said that the places with the most dynamic vegetation change seem to be where their fire has happened. They're the most fire-prone areas, are also the most dynamic vegetation changes. So I want to ask you to maybe change your thinking just a little bit for these next few maps. And instead of thinking of the calendar date, think of these as years post-fire. I think that kind of clarifies what we're seeing here. So we have this 1965 map that shows, and that was a soil veg map for anybody that's curious. It was made about 6 years after the 1959 fire. So this is 6 years post-fire. This is what the landscape looks like. It's almost half chaparral. There's still lots of woodland, but a lot of it is chaparral 6 years after a fire. Okay, let's jump ahead about close to 30 years, to 34 years post-fire. And you can see the chaparral has really shrunk down. The forest has expanded, and the conifer forest has grown quite a bit in those 30 years. Still mostly hardwood for the forest, but some conifers coming in. And then if we go ahead another 20 years, the hardwoods are giving way to the conifers. The shrub is shrinking even more, down to 7% from almost half. Whatever that is, 40 years before, or 48 years before. So let's just quickly so there's 6 years post-fire, 34 years post-fire, 54 years post-fire. And of course, this whole thing burned 7 years later in the Walbridge fire. Okay, let's look at one more frequent burn zone. This is the one in the Sonoma Napa area. So just east of Glen Ellen. And I think this is about 4,000 acres altogether. So again, we had a fire in 1923. And you'll notice these fires are happening at fairly regular intervals. So a big fire in 1880, which I didn't have enough data to actually map it, but I know that it occurred and it did some damage. So 1880, 1923, 1964, that's 43 years between fires. This one's 41 years between fires. And then the last one was 53 years, but roughly 40 to 50 years between these major fires, which is kind of an interesting pattern. Okay, so 9 years after 1923, 3/4 of this frequent burn zone is chaparral, mapped as chaparral. There's more data on that of exactly what made that up. A lot of it was chamise. There was also manzanita in there. A little bit of this, of course, was forest. Okay, let's go ahead from 9 years post-fire to 29 years post-fire. Now, in this case, I am jumping ahead to a different fire. So this is 29 years post-1964. But I think, to me, there's enough evidence for this progression and this kind of a cycle to kind of equate these two, to say, here's what it's like 9 years after a fire. Here's what it's like 29 years after a fire. So the shrub goes from 3/4 down to about 1/4. Conifers went from almost nothing on up to a substantial amount, and the forest cover went from about 1/4 up to about 2/3. And then if we go from there another 20 years, so now we're 49 years post-fire. Now we're more than 3/4 forest, and we're down to just a little bit of shrub, not a heck of a lot. Okay, so that's the sequence, and you can track these. This is just a rough approximation of how quickly these areas are filling in with trees. So after the fire, they seem to come back as chaparral, and then they fill in with trees. And you can see that there's kind of a rough balance between the addition of trees and the loss of shrub over this time post-fire. And the same thing's true for in the lake frequent burn zone. There is a curve here. It seems to happen more quickly earlier after a fire, and then it slows down later, which probably could be related back to the how fire tends to invigorate the landscape. I've come to think of this as kind of a seesaw. You get a fire, it pushes the amount of shrub up to higher levels, and then over time you get time pushes the woodland up, comes in, pushes the shrub down, another fire, you get the shrub up. And so this just kind of seesaws up and down over, over 40, 50-year cycles. And I'm not going to go into detail, but, there is the regrowth, reforestation where it was logged. It's different, but it's kind of, not a completely different magnitude. As opposed to Napa, where it's a little bit more than a tenth of this, less than a 10th or a 20th or 30th of these other places. And again, I can't explain that, but keeps you humble, keeps you honest. All right, now plotting. So if you take all these fires that have happened and you plot the size of the fire within the study area. So like the Nuns fire in 2017, it burned, well beyond the study area. But if you take the percent of the study area that it burned and plot that against the year down here, and the same thing for these other fires, the amount of within the study area that the Nuns fire of 1923 burned, and then also 1964. And you'll notice that, 1923 and 2017 seem to be kind of anomalies compared to these other fires, most of which are at about 10% or below. 1964, gets close to 20%, but it's still kind of down here toward the bottom of the graph. So, even though it is remembered, and coming back to the human side of this, we certainly remember the Nuns fire of 2017 as catastrophic. We could just call it a large fire, but I don't think that captures the human side of it, just to call it large. The Nuns fire is also remembered as somewhat catastrophic, although, you know, it only burned, I say only, and I don't mean to, I feel for the people that lost their homes in 64, but it was a few hundred compared to, you know, many thousands of people in 2017. And the 1923 Nuns Fire wiped out downtown Boise Springs. So that was, and people were running for their lives in their bare feet because the fire came so quickly. So, so a particular kind of fire, you know, that's really impacting people. All right, so that pattern seems to hold true in the other study areas. Here's the one we just looked at. So the Sonoma Napa area, over here in Lake County, we've got the Valley Fire is kind of way above everything else. There's a few other fires that kind of rise up above that 10% bar at the bottom. Sonoma West, same thing. You have two fires, 2017 and Walbridge 2020. I'm sorry, 1917, Walbridge 2020 were these very large catastrophic fires. And then in Napa, the Atlas fires of the last 30, 40 years are remembered as catastrophic. And I believe the fire of 1913 was thought of that way. I might need to go back and look to see how people described it. Anyway, the thing to notice here is that there are these occasional fires that seem to get very big, that people perceive as catastrophic, and that are sort of outside of the norm. So that makes me think, you know, is there a tipping point? Like, what was it that pushed those fires up into the catastrophic category? You know, we all know that there's a lot of things that play into wildfires. You know, here's some of the factors that play in. And I kind of think of this as these are like dominoes, and, you know, enough of these line up and you get an ignition and you have a wildfire, and these tip over, and in that sense, and a wildfire gets started. Now, also, you can think of this as if you take out any one of these, you're not going to have a wildfire, or at least not much of one. So if you take out, you know, if you raise the humidity by, you know, whatever, 30%, wildfire is much less likely. I mean, if the wind goes down, it's less likely. If the temperatures are cool, less likely. You know, if you don't get an ignition, you're not going to have a fire at all. So, so these are all factors that play into, you know, wildfires happening. And, you know, I'm sure these all were at play for the fires that are on this graph. But then these bigger ones, like, what was there a tipping point for these big ones? Was the humidity, you know, probably was especially low, but is there remember, a tipping point is a small change in conditions that leads to a large change in the outcome. So, you know, was like, you know, does a drop of 3% humidity or 5% humidity, does that suddenly lead to an especially large fire? Or is it just kind of a linear relationship? You know, as the humidity goes down, the chance of fire goes up. So some things to think about, you know, it's a special condition. They're not easily predictable. Once they're triggered, there's no way to reverse the process. And, you know, when a system passes through a tipping point, you know, the results are usually dramatic, and they happen quickly, and there's no forewarning. I mean, I think that describes these large fires we've been having recently. You know, match all those, check all those boxes. And understanding the causes behind the tipping points is important for preventative measures. So taking that idea, and, you know, and I would like to explore other tipping points, like humidity would be interesting. I haven't explored that one yet, but looking at woodland cover more or less increases at a linear rate, you know, over the whole study area. And as woodland cover increases over the years, the chance for catastrophic fire, you know, suddenly goes up after about 40 years. And remember those, you know, Sonoma Napa has a fire history of a large catastrophic fire every 40 or 50 years. So you get past 40 and suddenly chance of a large fire goes up. Now, so this is going to dip into physics for a moment. thank you for hanging in there with all this data and all these ideas. So percolation theory comes out of physics. It's been applied to wildfire. And it basically says that a catastrophic fire does not increase in a linear relationship with the density of forests. There's a tipping point. Now, we're talking about the real world, so I'm not going to say every time a forest gets to 59%, there's going to be a catastrophic fire. But I think it suggests there is a tipping point somewhere in that area. And I'll show you some things on tipping point in just a moment that'll clarify what exactly that percolation means. So, okay, you can go online and you can check this out. So this is a model, a very simple, 2D model from Northwestern University for fire. You can set the density right here, and then you hit go, and it starts a fire over here, and then it starts to burn, and then it will just stop it. Things will burn as far as they go, and then when it burns out, it burns out. So 55% density, you get 4% burn. If we up that to 59%, we're getting 36%. And this is a random process. So every time you run the model, it's going to come out a little bit different. Up at just from 59 to 60, and suddenly you're more than doubling the amount of area that burns. And then if you put it up to, actually I got these backwards, but it should be Calistoga over here on the left and Santa Rosa on the right. But if you up it to 72%, you suddenly get a fire that, is kind of scorched earth, leaves almost nothing. And so 59% you get, or 55%, you get 4%, up that by a little over 10%, and suddenly you've got 98% burn, which when I look at this feels like what happened in 2017 in parts of the county. Okay, so let's take a look at woodland cover and see if we can demonstrate that with the data. So here's Sonoma, Napa. Here's woodland cover. We saw this one earlier, and suddenly you get up here, and there's a fire that burns 70% once you get above about 60-70% woodland cover. Here's Sonoma West, same thing. There's a tipping point somewhere in here. Lake County might be a little higher, but still somewhere probably around 70-75%. And then again, Napa's the anomaly. I'm just going to leave that there for now and stay humble. So we can using the Sonoma Veg map. Thank you, Mark, for that. If you're here, you can take the footprints of these fires, these catastrophic fires that we had, and you can calculate, these fires that just happened a few years later, using that increase in woodland over time, calculate what was the density. And you can see they're all pretty much, except for Kincaid, which is kind of right on the cusp. 58%, that's getting pretty close to the cusp of catastrophic fire density. And then if you go back to 1993, which was the previous veg map, and do the same thing, you'll see that the density is, or the coverage, maybe I should use the word coverage rather than density. It's mostly below 60%. Not Walbridge, not true. And the Valley Fire was also quite high at that time, probably. But seems to suggest that there is a tipping point between these two figures. And there has been a little bit of work done on this. It seems like a promising place to think about, how we might apply this to, fuels management. And I should say we're gonna drop out of heavy data in just a moment. I should say that I think the percent woodland cover may be a proxy for a lot of things that are going on. It might be a proxy for, a combination of ladder fuels and, density of trees, and, it may boil down a lot of things into just, a single number that sounds simple, but it's actually incorporates a lot of different things. And that may be why this seems to work. This needs more vetting. I completely acknowledge that. I welcome other folks to take a look at this and see what you think. But it makes me hopeful, because if we could figure out a way to keep the landscape below that tipping point, which wouldn't necessarily require a lot of work if it's just dropping, the cover by a few percent, that seems hopeful. Okay, let's come back to Indigenous wisdom. Here's Clint McKay again. And one of the things that he told me was that in the old days, that the Douglas firs were mostly clustered up on the ridge tops, because they would burn from the bottom of the slope up to the top. And so any Douglas fir seedlings that were getting started on the slope would be burned. And so there's kind of a natural fire break at the top of a ridge, and that's where the Douglas fir would be. So so he mentioned that, and I thought, well, let's see, does that hold if we look at the historical evidence? And sure enough, it seems to be supported by the historical evidence. If you go back to the early surveys, this is the Sonoma Napa study area east of Glen Ellen. And I divided this up into the Napa side and the Sonoma side. So on the Sonoma side, Douglas fir is restricted to a fairly narrow elevation band. On the east side, which is probably a little cooler, it was a wider band. And then over the years, that elevation range has expanded, pretty dramatically, especially on the west. And then if we look at the other study areas, here's Sonoma West. This graph looks a little odd, probably because there's 100 years without vegetation data. But after 1965, suddenly the amount of Doug fir just, it's just creeping up the slope, creeping down slope, basically expanding to the edges of the study area between 1965 and 1993. So a very rapid Douglas fir expansion during those decades toward the end of the 20th century. And then here's Lake. Lake shows the same thing. And I left out Napa because, like I said, Napa doesn't really have the Napa study area doesn't have really any Douglas fir to speak of. But Sonoma West does have does go over to Napa County. So not Sonoma West. Sonoma Napa includes Napa County on the east side of the ridge. Okay, so let's take a quick trip through time. 1872, this is where the surveyors said they were Douglas firs. And you'll notice that these are kind of high up on the ridges, just as Clint was describing. Okay, let's zoom ahead about 60 years. And you'll see the Douglas fir are expanding, moving down slope, it appears. 60 more years, and the Douglas fir really stretching out over the landscape and moving down slope. And then 2015, which is just average between the veg maps on both sides. It's really spread out a lot and moved down slope. It's, some places it's gone to the lowest parts of the study area. So, what that makes me think of is, well, so what was the Douglas fir replacing? So these next few slides are just going to show, if you take in GIS, if you clip all the Douglas fir in modern times, we'll just call this modern times, and then you go back and see what was there before. So we're going to take this and go back to 1872. And in 1872, there was a good chance that you would have been standing in chaparral or hardwood forest, and only about one chance in 12 that you would have been standing in Doug fir forest in 1872. You might have been in another kind of conifer, but not in Doug fir. Okay, forward to the 1930s. The chaparral is starting to disappear. Most likely be standing in a hardwood forest now, or possibly, about 1 chance in 6 of being in a Douglas fir forest. Okay, the 1990s. Now you've got about 1 chance in 2 of being in Douglas fir forest, much less likely to be in hardwood, and very small chance of being in conifer and chaparral. And then, modern day, you would be in a Douglas fir forest. And again, this comes back. This doesn't mean that in the Douglas Fir Alliance, there's not some hardwoods, but it's been identified as Douglas fir is the most abundant species. And so we're going to go back to that, most abundant. So the increase over 140 years is about 13 times in area. And even in the last 20 years, it's doubled. So really a tremendous increase in Doug fir. And what does that mean for, land stewardship, land management? And this, thank you to Monica Del Martini, who gave me this slide from Open Space. So there's concern about Douglas fir encroachment happening, in places where it wasn't really seen before, which raises things like wildfire resiliency concerns. And having lots of Douglas fir contributes to extensive tree mortality. This was during the glass fire, and it impacts the human community. So, Douglas firs creeping down slope, are impacting humans, and also changing the habitat. So just an idea would be to think about, pushing Douglas fir back uphill a bit, that maybe they've expanded. If you go back to the indigenous thinking that, we want to try to keep things in some kind of balance. It seems like the Douglas fir have gotten out of balance recently, and also the, catastrophic fires are out of balance, and, maybe including Douglas fir, a recommendation for Douglas fir removal in certain areas. I'm not suggesting that this happens everywhere, but in certain places, there might be some advantage to that. That's just a thought. So coming back to the takeaways, one thing I didn't talk about was California Bay. It's not quite as dramatic as the Douglas fir, but California Bay hardly ever shows up in the early surveys. It's just barely there in the 1930s, and then recently it's much more common to see California Bay, in the vegetation maps. And again, Napa is an exception. Possibly geology. Somebody mentioned that. And so just a appreciation to lots of different individuals who've helped out here. Everybody's listed in alphabetical order, no particular order of preference. And there's a lot of people missing, certainly, but just want to thank all the people that have that I've touched base with over time, and then all these institutions and organizations that have in some way supported this work over the years that really began way back about 15 years ago when Pepperwood hired me to look at the historical surveys and see what that says about grasslands at Pepperwood. And it showed that the grasslands at Pepperwood are a persistent landscape feature. Maybe different type of grass in the past, but still as a life form grassland. All right, and you guys have my contact information, so you don't really need that. So I'll go to questions. I got a few extra slides at the end. I'll just leave this up just as a thought about the difference between a cultural burning cycle and untended cycle, which is what we've seen lately. All right, thanks everybody for hanging in there. I know it's a lot of information, and be happy to speak separately to groups or individuals, and you'll get the whole report in about a month and a half, and then you can delve in. Actually, maybe let me show you one more quick thing here. If I can bring it over. So this is, so when you do get the report, there's about 100 pages of results, which there's no way I was going to try to put that into the body of the report, but they're going to be in these appendices, which have a better map than you've seen so far. It goes into where the data came from, what the resolution is. You can kind of drill down on those things. But this one, I think you might find one of the most interesting. So, this is all boiled down to life form, but then within the life forms, it's also separated out into, different categories. So, the data gets fuzzier, back in the 19th century, but you can still make some comparisons. And as you come forward, like in this case, you can see, the amount of Douglas fir is changing quite a bit. You can see, anyway, you can follow what happens with different species. You can be more specific, drill down and get more detail. So just wanted to you'll be able to get that. And this will have, here's frequent burn zone changes. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. Fire tables. Okay, I'll stop. But thanks for hanging in there.
Thank you, Arthur. That was amazing. We really appreciate you taking the time and being able to provide that excellent, comprehensive overview of what you've been researching over the past. How long is your time period? It's been about a year, or?
The whole thing took almost 3 years. Yeah, it started
3 years. Wow,
3 years.
That's impressive.
And it was built on another project that started at Bouverie back in 2017. So
okay.
And then the 2017 fire really got my attention. So
yeah, right, right. Yeah, I guess it got your attention, huh? So there are a number of questions that came right out of the chat, and so I thought I would revisit that and see if there are still the question is still relevant. Let me see. I was thinking of one as you addressed the issue of the human footprint, and it hasn't really changed. Just the canopy was getting maybe more significance. So that kind of was addressed. There was a question about the tipping point by Caitlin, especially like as she says, how could we demonstrate the contribution of various possible tipping points? And this area is like possible tipping points could be ignition sources have greatly increased, or climate change has reduced humidity, and maybe some other points like the increased forest density. So I wondered if you wanted to try to address that question.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about all these things, and I don't have the ultimate answers to this, but so I would say, yeah, I mean, it's been pretty well established that the higher the human population you get, the more ignitions you will have for wildfire. So as the county population grows, we're going to get more wildfires. Does that necessarily mean that they're going to be bigger wildfires? I mean, I'm really looking at those anomalous fires, not all the ones that are happening down at the bottom. I think all these fires are probably subject to those. I'm going to go back up to that slide of dominoes. Let me see. Sorry about that. Okay. There we go. Yeah. So, I'm really looking at these anomalous fires. All these fires down at the bottom, they also happened. It'd be really interesting to see what was the humidity for all these fires. Well, here's my working hypothesis, is that a lot of these dominoes would hold true for these smaller fires. It probably was low humidity. These fires are almost all happening, basically all happening between August and October, with maybe a rare November ignition. That may be changing over time. I'm going to look at that in the study as well. I have all the dates. But yeah, the question really is why are these bigger? And remember that a tipping point is a small change in conditions that leads to a large change in outcome. So it's not just as a possibility, it's not, it would be if humidity suddenly between 10% humidity and 5% humidity, that the size of the fires dramatically increased. Like, that's a tipping point. And that's what seems to be demonstrated by the woodland cover. And there could be several tipping points in this. You know, maybe there's a tipping point both for humidity and for woodland cover. And when they both are surpassed, then you get these really big fires. I mean, I think those are both possibilities for sure. But I think, you know, woodland cover comes back to fuel at some level. So, you know, I would kind of include it in this domino, the fuel domino. But it's also connection. And, you know, okay, let me come back to just one more thing here. So the thing to remember about percolation theory that I don't think I talked about was that percolation theory really is just trying to predict how much density do you need for a fire to go from the left side to the right side across this matrix. So, you know, you have 55% density that it's not getting very far. The chance of it actually going percolating all the way through the forest, just like you can imagine water percolating through the soil. If it's 55%, you know, it's almost impossible for the fire to get all the way across this forest. But as you raise the density just by a little bit, you know, suddenly the fire can travel a lot further. And by the time you get up to 60%, the chance of a fire crossing this entire area, which, like I mentioned, makes me think of Calistoga to Santa Rosa, it suddenly goes up, you know, 3/4 of this is burning at 60%. So that's really what percolation is about the ability of fire to travel, let's just say, longer distances. And I think those longer distances are part of what makes something catastrophic. You know, it makes it more area burns because the fire can travel more easily through those areas. Does that all make sense?
I think per the percolation theory is a decent match for a flame front. But most of what makes the way you're defining catastrophic fire, it's mostly human impacts, and most of those human impacts, at least in the recent fires, have been from embers, and they don't care about forest connectivity. They just jump over large areas. Kara Leon has her hand up, and whatever she says overrides what I just said about fire behavior.
Okay, yeah, this is a working theory. I totally welcome these kind of questions.
So what I wanted to know about percolation theory is how is slope, wind, and, you know, humidity come into this theory of how much we're burning, because really it's the wind and the humidity baseline that are driving these events. And does this have an assumption that this is a medium humidity day, a high humidity day? How is that being calculated for in that graph?
Well, you know, I mean, I'll just say right off, it's not being calculated. This all needs further explanation. But I guess what I would think of, you know, is that all these fires that happened lower down here, you know, the humidity we can establish, hopefully at least with some records going back into the 20th century. The slopes haven't really changed, right? So, right. You know, I mean, yeah, slope does affect fire. I mean, these certainly are all factors, but I don't think, you know, slope isn't changing with time. You know, it's staying the same. So I don't think slope is the tipping point on a landscape scale. Maybe on a, you know, on a more of a local scale, maybe that's the tipping point. But and you're more of an expert on this than I am, but that's where my thinking goes. You know, like I said, maybe there's 2 or 3 tipping points. Maybe it's humidity plus density.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's your basic fire triangle model, right?
But I don't.
How the 3 things in that fire triangle work together are going to determine, you know, what the fire behavior is going to be. And there's nuances to that, and there's the polyhedron, and there's all these other models that they use for that. But it basically comes down to, if the fire starts on any given day, what's the wind, what's the humidity, and what's the fuel? And that's going to drive. So a lot of it is just when did the fire start? What day did it start? Is really going to determine how it burned. And the other thing that I was thinking about when I was looking at those graphs is that, well, this increasing size is certainly true right now for every fire in the West, right? you can, the last 10 years, fires are getting way bigger and way more intense everywhere in the West. So it's echoed by what's happening writ large as well.
I think one of the parts that is so powerful about the presentation that Arthur gave was that it's looking at the trends over a significant amount of time. And from a land manager perspective, you start to look at what can we do to hedge our bets, if you will. So you think about, like, Arthur brought up the density of the forest. Is that a factor that we can play with in certain locations to reduce the amount of threat? And then the other part I was thinking about is, there's that climatic change. So we know the climate has been changing over time. And maybe the fires have been more intense, but this data says we've seen these peak moments. Otherwise, there's been relatively small fires. And so maybe that's enhancing our capacity to doing more prescribed burns on a regular. And I'd really like to kind of think through the land management practices that we can try to instill based on those historic trends, and how do we avoid those maximum events that are clearly documented in so many different areas.
And the complexity of that is that all of those things are going to be different depending on the dominant species.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult thing to do, and to jump out and say what Caitlin commented, that she's concerned that people are going to see that 69% number and extrapolate it all over the place. And I am concerned about that too. And I've seen people take data from one report that said, oh, if you decrease by 40%, well, that was done in chaparral in Southern California. And how does that apply to our world? And I see people kind of jumping out there and making very bold statements about what we should do and how we should do it that kind of don't apply everywhere, and that concerns me. Yeah. And I see Fred just turned his camera on, so I'm just going to throw in one thing and then I'll pass it over to Fred or whoever the moderator wants to pass it on to. One of the things that I've always wanted to see, and this is just curiosity, is how do heavy precipitation years fit into this? So if you had a heavy precipitation year, are we more likely to burn the next summer or not? And I've always kind of wondered about that and gone back and forth on it. It would be really interesting to throw annual precipitation into some of these chart lines and kind of figure out. Yeah, it'd be really an interesting number to get to. And then, stuff like, a snow year like this, I think that we're going to definitely increase potential in the higher elevations who got a lot of snow, because there's a lot of tree breakage and stuff. And so there's so much that goes into all of this that it's.
Yeah, I'm not
easy.
I just want to say that, I started off saying this doesn't apply everywhere, that this, I'm looking at these particular areas that are considered fire prone areas by CAL FIRE. So this isn't making a prescription for everywhere, even in Sonoma County or even, but it is looking at areas that are considered fire prone and suggesting, even like one idea is maybe, like those frequent burn zones, which are pretty much outside of human habitation areas. Maybe this would require more study, but maybe they sort of act like a tinderbox for these bigger fires, and so maybe just focusing some management on those areas would have an outsized effect. I don't know for sure, but that's just a thought. I agree. I don't want anybody to take this too broadly. I see that happening a lot, just like you've mentioned, where people take one study from the Northwest and they apply it to, Sonoma County when it really probably isn't applicable. So it's all pretty local, but there do seem to be some patterns with these large fires. So yeah.
Awesome research. I love this, Arthur. Yeah. I'm really excited about how we might use this, especially to address those frequent flyer areas, right? Because clearly there's a problem there and we need to fit that into our calculations somehow. And how do we do that? So thank you so much for all this awesome research.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to come talk to you individually or with Permit Sonoma or,
Yeah, I would love to have you come talk to the rest of the gang at Permit Sonoma, and we're supposed to do lunch, so let's talk.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Sounds good. Let's
All
go
right.
to Fred and then Ellie. Ellie, did you have a question that was directly related to that last comment?
Yeah, it was more of a comment. I'm agreeing with something that Caitlin just put in the chat, that in your report, and I think this is really important, because once you write a report, it goes out and the rest of the world sees it and they interpret it and take action based on it. I saw this with riparian vegetation and the blue-green sharpshooter, that a beautiful report was written, but it was interpreted as, oh, we need to go out and remove all the riparian vegetation to protect our vineyards. So if your report could have, maybe in several places, the caveat that Caitlin writes, maybe a little differently worded, don't just go out with your chainsaw, but explaining the importance of nuancing and understanding the specifics of your property. Because I could see people going out and saying, oh, we need to have more gaps in the canopy. We need to do more fuel breaks, not just shaded fuel breaks. So I'm just saying, I'm sort of bowing to the power of your report and your credentials, Arthur, because they're, quite august. So, and thank you for this work. It's beautiful.
No, thanks, Ellie. And I totally hear that we need to be careful how this gets rolled out. And I also think that, that the opportunity that we have right now is that we have these big areas that recently burned. So we don't have to go in and cut a bunch of trees down. We just need to think about how we're managing them for the future so they don't end up, with as much cover. Whatever that, maybe it is, prescribed burning every 10 years or whatever Clint's calendar would say, that kind of thing.
Nice. All right, let's go to Fred. Thanks for your patience.
Oh, my pleasure. Could you let me share the screen for a second?
Sure, let me stop.
Okay, and there. This is an example of that percolation stuff.
I can't see it yet, Fred.
We're not seeing it yet, Fred.
You're not seeing it. You're not seeing it. Share screen. Photos. Allow. Open system preferences. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Nope.
Okay. Well, I will leave it at yeah, whatever. Can you see that?
Sorry.
Not seeing it.
I'm still not seeing it. What I'm showing is a picture of Rancho Mark West, where it was a tree plantation, a Christmas tree plantation. And I guess I'm not Zoom capable yet. However, the trees were all really well spaced and the ground was really clear. And when the forest fire hit the old conifer plantation, there was enough space in between it for the trees not to burn. And it was on flat ground. And I was just shocked at how well it came through the fire. It's got fire on both sides of it, but the conifers survived. In the future, I will figure out how to get it up on the screen.
So you're saying there wasn't much space between the canopy in that case?
There was a lot of space between the canopy.
Oh, okay.
And so
can you measure that percentage?
I could measure it in percentage, of course.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
And it's just yeah, I just don't know quite how to do it here to show you. But it's Rancho Mark West. They are cedars, they are Doug fir, they are a variety of trees, and they all have about a 5-foot separation in between them. And it's worth a field trip. These are the things that did not burn in the fire. Okay,
maybe can you send a link or send a JPEG of the picture you're looking at?
Sure, I will do that.
Okay, send it to Adriana and we can take a look at it. All right, great questions, you guys. Thank you, Fred, for sharing that. Let me see.
Such as it was.
Is there, I saw a couple other questions scattered in through here. Does anybody have anything specific they want to share?
I might jump in. I was just curious, Arthur, when they did a similar study in Marin, they only found, and I'm just bouncing this off of you to say yes or no or that kind of stuff. They found that over the past, I think it was 50 to 70 years, they found somewhere in there, I don't remember the exact numbers, only about a 7% increase in bay laurel canopy coverage relative to their original population size, and about a 18% in Douglas fir relative to population size. Because a lot of people have been asking this question, where do these numbers come from when everybody says, you know, it's mostly bay laurel and Doug fir that are filling in everything? And I think we all kind of know it intuitively, and your numbers are really different. They're much more aggressive. Can you comment on that or not?
Well, all I can say is, you know, I'm piggybacking on a lot of other people who've, you know, looked at vegetation over the last 150 years. And but I would, at least going back to say 1930s, so 90 years ago, I would feel pretty confident about, you know, how those people were approaching vegetation mapping. And there seems to be, you know, a pretty direct line from what they were doing to, you know, what's happened here more recently with vegetation mapping, that it seems to be, you know, a similar approach, I would think. So if somebody in 1930, you know, said this is a Douglas fir forest, or let me put it another way, I don't think somebody would have been standing in the middle of an oak woodland with a couple of fir trees in 1930 and said, oh, this is Douglas fir forest. And then somebody comes back to the same situation today and says, no, that's Douglas fir. I mean, there may be some edge examples, you know, but I think overall, you know, they're describing the vegetation in order of abundance. I mean, that's true for all these data sets.
I think these guys ran it aerially. I mean, maybe it's just this artifact of a completely different sampling approach, but I don't think so. I'm willing to bet you're not going to get huge discrepancies like that between aerial surveying and ground truth surveying. I'm guessing it's, I don't know, maybe burning ran differently in Marin. Maybe I'm just throwing up stuff out there. I'm trying to figure out, or maybe it's just a question of climate. Maybe Doug fir and bay laurel just aren't as aggressive in a cooler, wetter climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have some local conditions that are making it especially. I mean, the fact that Napa has virtually no Doug fir is a surprise.
Yeah,
right.
You know,
we have 2 minutes, so let's go to Adriana first, and then Fred. Yeah, Fred, you still got a question?
No question.
Okay, and then Ray after Adriana.
Okay, thanks, Kim. And thank you, Arthur, for this amazing research that you've been working so hard on. It's really cool to see what you've been doing. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reading your paper later. I have a question about the frequent burn zones and vegetation management. I guess, so we're looking at vegetation changes in the frequent burn zones, which obviously are changing towards conifers and bay laurels, sort of like on a fire cycle. But if like hypothetically, if that burn zone was managed for chaparral, chamise, do we have any reason to think that it wouldn't burn still intensely? Shrubs carry fire. Sure. As well as forest cover differently, but they do. So it's kind of, I was just thinking, like, is it really a forest cover, issue, or is it just that the other conditions in those frequent burn zones are such that they will burn whether it's shrub cover or a tree cover?
So, well, the big fires seem to happen when there's a lot of tree cover. I mean, that just seems to be for the most part. There was one. Well, okay, this is sort of an anomaly that maybe proves the case. In 1936, just 13 years after the Nuns fire, there was a large fire in the Sonoma Napa burn zone. But at that time it would have been, so we're talking 4 years after the map that shows it being, 75% chaparral. So there was a fire there at that time. It did burn like 3,000 acres. But it didn't burn 10, 20, 50,000 acres. It didn't spread across the whole landscape. So I kind of wonder if, percolation might also work with chaparral, that maybe at a certain point after a fire, that, there's enough chaparral to actually percolate the fire through, a larger area, but for whatever reason, in the frequent burn zone, some of them get up to 75% chaparral, but as far as the entire landscape, even in the earliest days, the landscape is at most 50% chaparral. So it never quite reaches that percolation threshold. And then as you get, when the trees reach the percolation threshold is when the big fires happen. That seems to be the case.
Okay.
The catastrophic fires. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking like it doesn't have to be tree cover, or could it be or could it be, percent shrub cover? Any kind of vegetation cover will hit that percolation threshold. So thank you. That's interesting, and we got more to learn.
And that one more other little sidelight is that there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on kind of in the field on percolation, but in Africa there's a study done on savanna, which is kind of the flip. It's so as long as there's like 60% grass cover, then it will stay savanna. But if the trees take over more than, if the trees are about 40%, if they start moving into the savanna, then the savanna starts to be lost because the trees are taking over the flammable part of the landscape. There's a lot of nuances here for sure. But
I just wanted to rescue Fred's photo that he wanted to share with us.
Oh yeah,
and that's
thanks.
the old Christmas tree farm that and the conifers scorched on the upper hillside.
So if we have an aerial of that, we could figure out the percentage of cover right there. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, and it burned across this valley. It burned on the far side of the valley as well. And yeah, we could do an aerial or another method from the grounds. But I was shocked that these trees made it through.
Hey, Fred, that Christmas tree farm was immaculate. I mean, they had mowed it and raked it and limbed it up 20 feet. I mean, I don't think there are any lessons to be learned from that. There are areas in the Mark West watershed that had been previously mechanically treated and prescriptive burn and applied, and the glass fire did in fact bypass them. They burned on all sides, upwind, downwind, laterally, and the standing trees, the canopy did not ignite. So certainly managing the understory affects the progress of catastrophic fire through the landscape, but I don't think that Christmas tree farm has many lessons for us.
Oh, I agree with you, Ray, and also agree to disagree a little bit. I think that the spacing of the trees there and the distance between the canopies, and what I try to implement in forestry, and I say, don't let the canopies touch for growing individual trees. And it's possible to see that on a landscape level.
I want to just piggyback and say, like, I think Ray has a great point about a surface fuel loading and how that affects, it's not just the canopy cover that you can see aerially, but it's definitely what's happening on the ground as well. So if that was an immaculate farm, it's like, oh, that definitely contributes to what's happening there too.
All right, folks, it's 12:04, and we really want to thank Arthur for spending the afternoon or the morning with us to share his data and his results. So a round of applause for our man and from Sonoma Mountain.
Thank you.
And folks, thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate you guys, your great questions, and we will see you next month, and look forward to continue to hear from you all. All right.
Thanks everybody for listening and for all the questions. Yeah, it's good. Good stuff.
Good.
Thanks, Arthur.
See you, folks.
Bye.